Hello, everyone. This is Cadet Howard Bermudez. I'm with Alex Duppstadt, Kellen Rao, Isaiah Sanders, AC Tuma, and Jacob Wilbers. And this is our presentation for our capstone experiment regarding USAFA Airmanship Next and Pilot Training Next experimental. Main thing about our main goals for this project is to assess the Airmanship 300 Airmanship 302 program at USAFA. This is their first year going through this program, where for the first 10 lessons, the cadets are going through VR training at USAFA, and then after that, they'll go through a 20-lesson course down at our airfield, and to try to transfer their VR training to the actual aircraft. These results that we have found, or some of the claims that we have found, are going to be helping Airmanship Next on how their program is going. Not necessarily throw spears, but to help them improve on how they can move forward in the future. Also, our experiment our experiment is regarding objective evaluations, aka grade cards, performance data from the airfield, and trying to figuring out how well the cadets performed going through that program. All right, so our approach, we're gonna explain the data. We're gonna let the data explain the results themselves. For the self-reporting, we took some surveys. We asked the cadets to take surveys before and after the program to see if they thought that the program itself was successful or not. We also had observations from the lieutenants that taught them in the VR program, and then just seeing how their attitudes, their performance in VR, and then we can compare that to the grade cards when they complete the flying portion of the program, and which is for the next thing, the performance results from the grade cards that we gathered, and then we're going to compare that to the previous airmanship program, Airmanship 420, that cadets were going through before this year. Same aircraft, but just different program because they didn't have VR in Airmanship 420. All right, just a quick overview of the proposed USAFA airmanship model. As you can see, as where normally this is going to be the track of when 4 degrees come into, or 4 degrees or freshmen come into USAFA. They'll go through the various airmanship programs their freshman year, moving on to 3-degree year, 2-degree year, and then their senior year. But obviously, like, since this is just this year, some of the juniors have been put into this program to be the test subjects on how this program is going to be successful or not. And one of our goals is to see if they are successful or not based on their performance. All right, so just a quick overview on what AV 300 and Airmanship 302 is about. First 10 lessons, which is AV 300, is going to be just an hour and a half of VR every other day for their class. It's going to be classroom style where instructors are walking around teaching students how to do certain maneuvers, and then going around and watching them how they do, and then giving them some feedback and how to improve. So once they go down to the airfield, it's a maximum of 4, or they have 14 scheduled sorties. Sometimes it gets more than that depending on if weather cancellations or anything, but their goal is 14 sorties. They get 1 solo in that, and then 1 check ride as well, which validates the initial flight training requirement for all those that are heading off to pilot training for the Air Force. And then so in total, they get 105 contact time or 105 hours contact time at the airfield. And with their syllabus, they have to pass their written exams with 85%, their VOFEs with 100% before they get onto the airfield, pass onto the airfield to fly in the P-53. For Airmanship 420, this is the traditional power flight program prior to this AV 302, or AM 300. So they only get 9 sorties, with 10 being their solo, or if they're not doing well enough, then the 10th flight is just going to be just an orientation flight, just trying to have fun and encouraging those that participate to pursue a rated career. They only get 32.5 hours of contact time, and then same requirements for their syllabus. They need to pass 85% on their exams and boldface of 100%. For our measures, we were able to get 20 grade cards from Airmanship 420 and compare that with 16 grade cards initially with Airmanship 302. So the way we organized it is we had 6 columns per maneuver, which those maneuvers were from the syllabus requirements that is those maneuvers are going to be ones that they do every flight. So for every maneuver, we had 6 columns, where the first column is the flight number that they met the MIF. The second column is the flight number that they were consistent and didn't have an unsat grade, and then the third column is how many times if they didn't meet MIF right away, how many times they were unsat in those in between the 2 flights or the multiple flights. And then the next 3 columns are how many fair grades they had the entire program, how many good grades they had in the entire program, and how many excellent grades they had in the entire program. So we compared those together to try to figure out where the correlation is or where the differences are from the VR course or the Airmanship or the 302 course and the Airmanship 420 course. And we also had them take survey data to allow us to figure out any differences in the 2 programs. For the survey results, we had very minimal participants, as you can see on the left side of the slides. There's only 14 that completed a pre and post survey, so it's very hard for us to get any strong statements that came out of the data. But one of our suggestions later on is to help us move forward and be successful is just having the surveys as part of the syllabus, because as of right now we're just getting volunteers. We're sending them an email asking them, hey, can you fill out the survey before your program starts and then afterwards, so we don't have as much data to go off of. But we have, as you can see, the circle says that I believe that training in virtual reality flight trainer will improve my performance. We had an outstanding amount of positives for that. So as you can see, the 5 is a strongly agree on the Likert scale, and then the mean of it is 4.8. So most people do agree that that the VR program is going to help them improve their performance. And we didn't, like, looking at the pre and post surveys, none of them decreased, as in someone put a 5 at the beginning and then after the program they went to a 4. It was all 4s to 5s, or if they were already at 5s, then they stayed at 5s. So in reality, a lot of this is very difficult to have a strong claim because, like I said, there's not enough data or not enough participants. But one of our suggestions that we'll talk about later on in this presentation is to incorporate in the syllabus so everyone that's going through the program is mandated to do the pre and post survey. And I will hand it off to Alex to talk about the IP observations.
So I was able to interview the casual lieutenants that worked with these programs and was able to determine the top 3 strengths and the bottom 3 weaknesses of the program itself. The main things that the IPs were very, I guess, passionate about was the fact that this program gives exposure to cadets that would maybe have never had it in the VR and in live flight, and that exposure motivates them to learn more about flying and about aviation in general, and this in turn prepares them for pilot training and any avenue they take on after the academy. The procedural strength was the second one. Just getting their checklist and radio calls, like type procedural knowledge down in the VR, really like in a sim type environment, really like boded well when they went out to live flight, because they already had those skills down so that they could focus more on the actual flying piece once they got to the plane, because of the high amount of reps in the sim. Because in the sim, you can fly a sortie 100 times in the span of a couple days, whereas in live flight you're not afforded that opportunity. That kind of leads into the number 1 strength they said was overall just gaining exposure, just getting the feel of how the plane both feels and what it's like being in that pilot like role. Cuts the learning curve once they actually get to the plane. They're not like fumbling around like trying to figure it out. Once they get to the plane, they've already gotten exposure with it, so it allows them to learn live flight in a more in-depth manner, like quicker. And now for the weaknesses, they said the biggest weaknesses were almost obvious. The sight pictures were the biggest one because they are flying two different planes between the sim and live flight. So, there's different wing settings and different cockpit views. So students in the results said that the sight pictures really threw them off with like landing and takeoff and really every maneuver like in the air between the sim and the live flight. This, in addition to the differences in control mapping, really kind of threw them off because they were so used to the sim that once they got to the live flight, they weren't used to the configuration in the real aircraft. So actuation of switches and their muscle memory was all kind of thrown off. And then the last one was, I guess, something that the IPs would do differently if they could go back would be communicate these differences to the students prior to the students getting out to the live flight, because in the sim, the students built a large sense of confidence, which wasn't necessarily bad, but they didn't really know about these differences going into the live flight. So this in turn like negatively affected some of their performances because they were down on themselves because they expected that they should have been able to get the live flight as well as they had gotten the sim.
This is Kellen Rao now, so I'm going to go over some performance results and then a little bit of discussion based off that. So just to kind of go over the results for AB302, which, just a quick reminder, that is the course with the VR exposure as compared to AB420, which is the course with zero exposure in VR. So AB302 was able to outperform and reach MIF quicker in mission planning, takeoff, climb, level off, communications, emergency procedures, and general knowledge. So they were able to achieve and maintain those skills at a proficient level quicker than in AB420, whereas AB420 achieved and maintained these skills quicker in ground ops, pattern, normal landing, checklist use, and clearing. And there were no significant differences in en route descent, general aircraft control, situational awareness, or task management. So now onto a little bit of these. So kind of a couple things that we learned from this data is that USAFA Airmanship Next is able to improve power flight performance in a lot of areas, but it's by no means a replacement. So it's complementary, it's going to add experience, and is especially beneficial at times when there's inclement weather. So here at the Air Force Academy, in this past academic year alone, there have been over 650 sorties canceled. So having this VR opportunity is beneficial in that aspect to give experience, but by no means replaces the live flight experience. So general knowledge, emergency procedures, communications, mission planning, those are all were improved with that VR exposure in AB302, especially general knowledge and emergency procedures during initial flight training. So that's something that no matter how you get that experience, whether it's VR or in live flight, or even a classroom setting, you're still going to benefit from increased exposure for those aspects. So AB420 actually outperformed in pattern, normal landing, and clearing. So for clearing, it's logical and makes sense for there to be or to outperform with a lack of VR training. So during VR, it's very easy to be cockpit focused and not be looking outside of the aircraft. So that's definitely a negative training transfer that likely occurred during VR training. However, for pattern and normal landing, it's a bit unexplained as to why we necessarily outperformed when the VR training was not present. So we're still researching into as to why that occurred. So and there was no significant performance difference with general aircraft control, task management, or situational awareness. Just things to know, and more research needs to be done on that. Bottom line, though, is we need more data in order to research these topics more, and that's what we're going to be working on moving forward. And now on to...
Jose Sanders here to talk more about the experiments that we set up for PTN-X and looking at some of the factors associated with that. Some of the big factors that we had in mind when trying to set up this experiment and looking at what to test are, one, the negative effects of virtual reality, understanding that there are simulated sickness and eye strain or different effects like that, physiological things that occur when you're in a virtual reality situation or scenario for extended periods of time. We also wanted to look at the role of motion in that and seeing if there's a way to reduce some of those negative effects if you have a motion seat or something of that like that can help you make it feel more realistic when you're flying in the scenario. We also additionally wanted to look at the difference between adaptable versus adaptive training and looking at what's the best way to truly train trainees and students as they go through the training program. So where we're at now, we were not able to complete a lot of testing concerning these experiments, but I will talk more towards the design of them and the potential effects that they could yield if they were able to be executed. So ideally, we'd be able to set up 2 experiments and have 4 total test groups. So we would have a between subjects test basically occurring in both scenarios. So regardless of which test they were in, though, the overall procedure would look very similar. So I'll talk through the common points and then show where it's a little bit different. So for both experiments, whether it's the training experiment looking at adaptive versus adaptable training or the motion versus no motion experiment, we would start off by taking the participant through a series of surveys, especially an SSQ, to include an MSQ, a pre-survey, but then also an SSQ that they'll actually be taking that one multiple times throughout the course of the experiment to kind of track their symptoms and what they're experiencing as they spend time in the VR. With that, after introducing them, allowing them to take the surveys, we would guide them through a 2 to 4 minute familiarization flight, helping make sure that they have a basic understanding of where the controls are with the stick and the throttle and everything, and being able to maneuver in a virtual reality environment, and also being able to accomplish basic flight tasks, whether that's simply turning or rolling the aircraft and doing things like that. And then the next part of the experiment would be where things start to get a little bit different. So if you're in the motion experiment, you would then go through a low to high difficulty scenario, going through a set of flight maneuvers that we would guide them through, about 8 to 10 different maneuvers, again, increasing in difficulty to hopefully see if we induce the onset of some of those negative symptomatic experiences that are associated with flying in a virtual reality scenario. Allowing them again to tell us when they start feeling a significant onset of any of the symptoms that they saw in the SSQ before, and trying to record the time when that would happen. If you were in the training experiment, then the way that this would look different, or if you're on a motion experiment, you would do that scenario and one group would be doing it while the motion chair was activated, and they were experiencing it that way, and the other group would do it without the motion to kind of provide that baseline or control. On the other side, if you're in a training experiment, you would have 2 minutes to practice takeoffs, 3 minutes to practice in-air maneuvers, and 4 minutes to practice landing. And the difference here would be whether, depending on which group you're in or condition you're exposed to, one group would be doing have essentially, if they're in an adaptable training group, then they would be doing this without any coaching or guidance and simply have time to reset the scenario as many times as they need to practice each of these different things, whereas the adaptive training group would have one of the experimenters guiding them through and essentially providing an intelligent tutor to help guide them through each step when they made mistakes. Then, again, the end of each experiment would look very similar because we would put all the participants through a VFR flight scenario at the end to evaluate how well either the training scenario how effective that was, whether they were adaptive versus adaptable. And then if they're in the motion scenario, this again just provide another evaluation step to see the effects of that type of training, but then again just prolong their exposure to VR so we can track again their simulator sickness experiences at the end of the experiment. Altogether, we should be able to get this done in about 45 to 50 minutes, which is close to the time period of a class period for a cadet, so it's reasonable to get done there too. And then again, when it says that we would give them 4 questionnaires, it would be at the very beginning of the testing, after the familiarization flight would be 2, 3 would happen right before the VFR flying pattern, and then the 4th one would be after they're done with that pattern as well. And then we would just let them know to email us or respond back to us within the next 24 hours if they felt the onset of any of those symptoms later on. This diagram essentially just shows kind of a more simplified breakdown of what I just explained in the last slide. Again, using randomization to find those 4 groups of cadets to be able to test, and keeping the 2 experiments separate so that there's no confounding variables between motion and which type of training you experienced. Then as far as just from a big picture what PTN does or is, when we look at pilot training next, through the use of the VR and the simulator-based training, we're hoping to minimize costs, streamline the training process, and still produce quality pilots, which I believe the first iterations of pilot training next have shown that we can do, continuing to try to substitute some of the live flight for virtual reality flight so that, again, we can do it in a cheaper way, but that still is suited towards the participants or the trainees. As far as why are we doing this, again, there's a significant pilot shortage in the Air Force, and I believe PTN helps provide a training pipeline that can help us address that issue, while also trying to help unclog some of the training pipelines that may currently be experiencing blockages and then or slowed rates. And then as far as the other implications of this experiment is just really trying to figure out what's the best way to train. What is it adaptive and allowing micro level remediation and training people based off of their mistakes at a live speed, or adaptable and allowing them to teach themselves. We understand that there's no silver bullet because everybody learns differently, but still trying to provide research that helps answer that question.
Awesome. Thanks, Isaiah. This is our last slide just to kind of show where we're going, or was our way ahead for both programs or both parts of our capstone. So essentially, we weren't able to do our testing. That's bottom line. But at the same time, we're going to do our best to set up next year's team to be able to start early, start being able to analyze the program, AV302 program, as well as start doing testing as well, because we essentially had our test ready to go, but this with COVID-19 coming up, we weren't able to start actually testing. So also, we're going to try to ask, we're trying to keep having more surveys. Like as you saw earlier, we only had 14 participants, but getting more grade cards, getting more surveys completed will be able to help us better analyze the situation. So we may be able to have more claims and help Airmanship Next and PTN be moving in the right direction. So if also it's possible, we can match grade cards with names to be able to track, as you saw from the model, be able to track from their freshman year to their senior year, and then even afterwards to their pilot training. Maybe we can show them what's the best learning styles for that person so they can better tailor that and either complete pilot training faster or ensure that they are successful when they go through the program. We also had something that's very interesting for us. One of the leads from Airmanship Next told us that he noticed that gaming experience feel a huge factor in successes in their in the cadets. So maybe we can look, or next year's group can look into that aspect. So and see how much it does factor and have some data to actually back that up. I mentioned this earlier, having the surveys as part of the syllabus, so we have more participation. Ultimately, one of the things that we wanted to get done with the survey or the grade cards analysis, but we never was able to, is how many flights it eventually saved. How much does VR allow cadets or prepare cadets to get into the live aircraft and be more successful quicker than people from like Airmanship 420 who didn't have the VR training beforehand. See how many flights they saved, which ultimately will lead to money saved because there's less sorties to get them to solo. Another big picture thing is the balance of VR to live flight. How much VR sorties do we have cadets or pilot trainees go through, and how much live flight they have? How long is VR useful for? How many, like, is it good for half a half a program or half the length of a program, or what is it? Because we don't need to put people in VR if it's not going to help them anymore. So essentially, is it supplemental? Is it a replacement? Like, what's the best way to, where does VR ultimately lie on the training scale? And then something with the motion. This has been a topic for our capstone throughout, and is how much is motion really going to affect learning in the VR? Is it going to be worth the money to avoid the VR sickness if we add motion in there? Is it going to be is it more important to just focus on figuring out what's the best learning style for individuals to be successful? So since we had 2 different tracks on our project, we were trying to figure out the best way with the fact that we weren't able to do any testing. Unfortunately, we couldn't really determine which side of the scale we agree with, but at the same time, just being able to have the foundation for next year's group to be able to move forward with our success and learn from our failures this semester or this academic year will hopefully get them to answer some of these questions that we pose for our way ahead. So with that, thank you for listening to our presentation. We'll be available for questions throughout the time, but as of right now, thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.